Hi. When I was in the classroom, I taught a number of years in both 6th and 8th grades English language arts. I had a sense at the beginning of the year where I was going to be going through the whole year. A variety of different terms that we put on that idea. One of them is scope and sequence. So that whenever I got up in front of my students to give a lesson, I knew where that lesson fit into the whole year. I found that doing this series of conversations has been a little bit more difficult than a year teaching. I started with a plan, but that plan played itself out, and then I developed a second one, and that played itself out also, and a third maybe, and that's kind of played itself out, although I may, from time to time come back, talk about things in groups of 5 or something like that again. But I thought what I would do is do a vocabulary study. It kind of fits into my English language arts field. But this would also be a theological vocabulary. One of the accusations that I have heard against the church and against Christians kind of in general, and maybe accusation is a little bit strong, but it's certainly a critique, is that we are what has been called biblically illiterate. One of the ways is that the Bible stories haven't been told like they used to be, and that we have a whole generation of people growing up without knowing the basic Bible stories. But there's a deeper level of what might be called biblical illiteracy, and this really has to do with understanding the language that we use as we talk about God's coming to us, what God did for us, how God brings us into fellowship or relationship with Himself. So I thought that'd be fun and hopefully instructive, useful, to do a series on key terms that we use to talk about God and talk about how we relate to God, what difference God makes in our lives. And I wondered how I might best do that if I would just create a list and put them in alphabetical order and kind of go through them that way. And then it occurred to me that another way to do this, and the way that I've chosen, is to do, in a sense, a book study. It's probably not surprising that I have found the letter to the Romans to be my favorite of the epistles in the New Testament. And I think the reason for that is simply that it has a very deliberate organization, that it very clearly outlines the gospel for us. Not that the gospel isn't in the other epistles, but this letter seems to have a more organized and systematic way about going about presenting the gospel. So I thought what I would do, and it is what I'm going to do, is walk our way through the letter to the Romans, finding terms, words, and maybe it's not just a word, but maybe it's a term that we need to have a better understanding of, or maybe even an understanding to begin with, a definition. And then as a part of talking about that definition, talking a little bit about why it's important for us to know this word and how it fits into the whole of the gospel. So then as I started looking at the letter to the Romans, I come to verses 16 and 17, which might be considered the thesis statement. For example, if the letter to the Romans is an essay or maybe a dissertation, it would be a short dissertation, but it would have to have a statement at its beginning that tells us what the whole essay or dissertation is about. And we find that in verses 16 and 17. But the key terms there are ones that I've decided I want to wait for later to put them into a better context. So I'm going to start in this vocabulary study with Romans chapter 1, verse 18. And the first word that I think is important for us to have a good handle of there is the word wrath. Now that may seem like a funny place to start, but Paul begins his explanation of the gospel by reminding us that God's wrath is revealed against ungodliness and unrighteousness. And for us to understand what that means, we need to have a handle on what the word wrath means. It's not a term that we use regularly in our conversation. As a matter of fact, I can't really remember a time when I have used the word wrath outside of studying Scripture, and particularly studying Romans and Romans chapter 1. There are other words that we could use to translate the word that Paul used there, remembering that Paul wrote this letter in Greek, and so when we bring it into the English language, we have to find a word that best gives us the same meaning of the words and ideas that he used. So another word that we might use here is the word anger. And so we might say that God's anger is revealed to us. God's anger against ungodliness and unrighteousness. And it's uncomfortable for us to think that God would be angry, to think that God would be wrathful. But that's where we need to begin, that God has established a standard, and that when we break that standard, it causes God to be angry. It causes wrath. And it results in a sentence. So let's put this in the sense of our legal system. Wherever it is that we live in the world, we live under some kind of legal system that has laws. And when those laws are broken, there are consequences for the breaking of those laws. Sometimes the consequences are clear. Sometimes the consequences are left up to some extent, the decision of a judge. Sometimes the consequences have a range of options and possibilities. What we find in Scripture is that the consequences of breaking God's law, of disobeying God's law, is that the fellowship that we have with God is broken and destroyed. And we're going to look at a number of other words in our study to look at how that is. So the word then that Paul brings to us about God's reaction to the fact that we break trust with him is the word wrath, that God is angry, that it is not pleasing to God, even to the point where we can use the word anger or wrath to describe God's reaction to our unfaithfulness. And as we go through the first chapter of Romans, actually the first 2.5 chapters of Romans, we recognize how this is true and why it is that God is angry, that God's wrath is revealed. Another interesting thing about this particular word is that it is not a sudden outburst. I think one of the things that I am too often guilty of is a sudden outburst. I noticed that in the classroom. I had to be careful that when students were disruptive, that I did not act in a sudden outburst of anger. And that if there was an anger that was brought out by their disrespect or their breaking the classroom standards, that it wasn't a lashing, an immediate emotional lashing out. And what we find with this word that we translate wrath or anger, we can also translate passion, but that it has to do with a long and ongoing condition. It is not an emotional outburst, but it is the consideration that God has because he has observed in us from Adam and Eve this propensity that we have to be disobedient, this propensity that we have to be rebellious. And so it's not an emotional outburst that God has, but it is a passionate response that speaks to us about his holiness. And we're going to look also, as we look at all of these terms that govern our fellowship with God, or we may say our relationship with God, that God is a holy God, and that God demands holiness, and that in order to be in God's presence, there is a standard that must be met, and that God reveals to us his anger. God reveals to us his wrath when we act ungodly and unrighteously. Not even that we act, but that we are ungodly and unrighteous. We're going to find that there is a solution to this problem. Because if we must stand under the wrath of God, there is no hope for us. But as we go through the letter to the Romans and comment on all these important words for us, we're going to find that God acts contrary, in a sense, to his wrath, and that he does that which is necessary for his wrath to be appeased. We can't, but he does. And in his doing, he brings us back into fellowship. So stay with me as we look at these words that are important for us to understand, as we consider what it is that God has done for us to bring us into fellowship with himself. I'm interested in your comments. Please leave them below. God bless you, and thank you for being a part of the conversation.